So now that we are done talking about the different types of marine ecosystems and all of the pollution problems that are facing the ocean right now, we're going to talk about overharvesting, which is something that we've been talking about since the very beginning of the school year, but now we're actually going to hit it head on and talk about all of the causes and effects of it. So your book says that of all the impacts facing the ocean, overfishing may be the most pressing, even more so than pollution because of the crazy ecological effects that overfishing has. Um, your book says there aren't always more fish in the sea, like that saying goes. It's not actually true. More than half of the world's marine populations are fully exploited, meaning that any harvesting would be unsustainable. So if we keep going, then we're going to run out. We can't harvest them more intensively without depleting them, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, and they all come up a lot in this. And so more than half are exploited, and another 28% are overexploited. So not fully exploited, but getting there and already being driven toward extinction. So despite increased fishing efforts, global harvests leveled off after 1998. So if the current trends continue, the collapse seen in the cod industry in eastern Canada and New England may repeat for all the world's fisheries. So in Newfoundland and in New England, we saw cod collapses, and they were ecologically devastating and took a big toll on the economics of those two countries. If the current trends continue, populations of all ocean species we fish for today are predicted to collapse by the year 2048. So that's pretty gnarly. That's not that far away, and all of the species would collapse. And if they do, we not only lose food, but we also lose the ecosystems that they are a part of. And the effects of that are that productivity would be reduced. The ecosystems would lose their resilience to change. And filtering of water would decline, which would lead to harmful algal blooms, which leads to dead zones, which leads to dead fish, and which leads to beach closures. So there's a hefty slippery slope here of the fisheries collapsing. And so industrialized fishing is what has led to this overharvesting. So humans have overharvested the oceans since the 18th century. So it's not really a modern thing. We led this stellar sea cow to extinction due to overfishing. So it's not just a modern problem. The sea cow was found in the Pacific Ocean near Alaska. And the difference back then, before industrialized fishing, is that the depletions were localized because they were only fishing in that one area. It wasn't a world problem of extinctions and overfishing happening. So we also almost hunted many whales to extinction up through the 19th century. But today's technology advances in the 20th century, along with massive ships, brought commercial fishing to unimagined levels of harvesting and initiated the fishery collapse that we've seen today. So it was happening in the 18th and 19th centuries, but because of the new technologies we have, and it has brought it to the fishery collapse that we're at today, because of massive ships and new technology. So there's 4 methods of fishing that we're going to talk about. The first one is called purse seining. And this is what's happening right here when they deploy large nets around schools of fish at the surface. And these large nets are held up by buoys. And so basically it's kind of like a drawstring bag that's a net. And the fish swim in, and then they close the top of the net like a drawstring around a hoodie. And then they reel it in. And then we also have what's called drift netting, which is the use of long nets that span large expanses of water and target species that traverse open water in large schools. And these chains of transparent nylon mesh are held up with weights or floats at the top and weights at the bottom. And they're drift with currents to capture passing fish. And that we have specialized forms of them that can be used for shark, shrimp, and other animals as well. That's drift netting, this one right here. Then we have what's called long line fishing, which involves setting out extremely long lines, up to 80 kilometers long, with hundreds or thousands of baited hooks spaced between their length. So if you can see, instead of it being a net, it's all of these different little hooks on there. And this is often used for tuna and swordfish, and obviously sometimes catches unintended fish. And then there's also trawling, which involves dragging a weighted cone-shaped net through either the pelagic zone or the benthic zone. It's called bottom trawling if it's the benthic zone. So the trawling captures pelagic fish, so the fish that live in the pelagic zone, and the bottom trawling works and collects the benthic fish and other organisms that live on the ocean bottom, like scallops and things like that. So industrialized fishing kills non-target animals and damages ecosystems. So bycatch is the name that we use for accidental capture of animals during industrialized fishing. So these are the fish that we were not attempting to catch, or the other organisms that we caught by accident. And up to 17% of all commercially harvested fish were captured unintentionally. And this bycatch has led to the deaths of millions of sharks, fish, marine mammals, and birds each year. Purse seining and drift netting captures dolphins, sea turtles, and seals that end up drowning or dying of exposure on the deck of the ship. Exposure meaning air exposure. So if fish will suffocate if they're not in water. And long line fishing captures turtles, sharks, and albatrosses that bite onto that hook that was intended for the fish they were catching. Albatrosses are birds, so there are even birds that are being caught as bycatch here. And drift netting is, what are we talking about? Drift netting is now banned in international waters, but there are still, because of the success of bycatch, but there are still places you can fish in different nations' waters where it's happening. And it's always happening. You can always do it illegally too, right? So dolphin bycatch during tuna yellowfish harvesting resulted in a massive drop in dolphin populations. So there's a lot of tuna that were living in the same areas as these dolphins. So the dolphins were being caught as bycatch, and it led to a huge drop in their population. Something like hundreds of thousands of dolphins were killed each year in the 1960s. So the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 forced fleets to modify their gear, allowing dolphins to escape. So this has dropped the levels of dolphins that are caught each year, but the dolphin populations haven't recovered yet because they were so damaged by this. So the bycatch has definitely dropped, but to about 2,000 per year since 1998, which is far down from hundreds of thousands per year, but they haven't recovered yet. And then in addition to bycatch, though, this bottom trawling, which was this method right here where we drag the cone-shaped net across the ocean floor or through the pelagic zone, can destroy entire benthic ecosystems. So the nets are weighted, and so when they land on these coral reefs or other benthic ecosystems, it can completely destroy them. So here is a coral reef at George's Bank before trawling, and this is it after trawling. So it has basically completely destroyed it. And they think that this area has been trawled up to 3 times. And so as it continues to happen, it just destroys it further and further. And so fisheries collapse quickly under intense harvest. So this, you probably would have known this, that a similar pattern has been observed worldwide. In about a decade following the introduction of industrialized fishing, catch rates drop precipitously, meaning a lot, with fish populations stabilizing at 10% of their former selves. So the fish population, because of industrialized fishing, dropped a lot, but that means that if it, since it's stabilized at 10%, that the ocean only contains about 10% of the large-bodied mammals that it used to because of overfishing. And when animals at higher trophic level are removed from a food web, which is what is happening here, we're catching the larger animals. The smaller ones are getting through the nets and they're not being harmed. It's the bigger ones. Their prey can proliferate because their predators are gone, and then it can alter the nature of the entire community, which is one of the ecological outcomes of overharvesting. And so even though the global fish catch, or the number of fish in the ocean, has collapsed, even though the fish stocks have collapsed, the global fish catch has remained stable. And the reasons for this, there's a few reasons. So fishing fleets are now traveling further. They used to be able to go right off the shore. Now they have to travel farther and farther to get to the less fished portions of the ocean. And when they get there, they're fishing from deeper in the ocean. So they're not catching as many surface fish. They have to go deeper to get the same number of fish. They're also spending more time catching the fish. And in addition to all of those things, to go further, deeper, and longer, there's new technology. So now we have sonar mapping equipment, satellite navigation, and thermal sensing systems where we can find the fish more easily. So it's easier to catch them than just random chance. And so the last thing that your book talks about is how we're fishing down the food chain, which means that in addition to fisheries catching less fish, the fish that are caught are smaller and younger because we haven't allowed them to grow back to be as old. Normally, cod can live up to 20 years, but at this point, it's really rare to find a cod that is more than 10 years old because we haven't allowed them to grow back to that age. So females that don't get to grow as old and grow as big don't have as many offspring. So it's a positive feedback loop of getting smaller fish and less fish, which puts the further pressure on fish stocks as older and larger females can produce more eggs. So we are just making the problem worse with the problem. And fleets are also targeting other species that are more abundant. So as we're overfishing these fish that we normally eat, we're looking to catch and sell fish that we didn't used to because we don't have another option. And these species are often smaller and farther down the food chain. Here's two examples of this. We're also looking for formerly undesirable fish that are being remarketed under new names. So this is an orange roughy, this fish, and it was formerly called slimehead because of its unique mucus canals. And now it's sold as orange roughy, and it's a fish you can eat. But no one would ever catch it before because it was gross, but now it's one of the only options that we have. There's also something called the toothfish, which is now known as the Chilean sea bass, which is a very fancy and expensive fish to get at restaurants. It's not biologically classified as a sea bass, but that's what it's called. And now we harvest it because we are running out of other fish. But now we're seeing that these fish species are also becoming overfished, forcing harvesters to fish even further down the food chain. And the loss of this marine biodiversity erodes ecosystem services. So as we are losing this biodiversity, we're losing the top of the food chain, and we're just fishing further and further down. What's happening that we're losing the ecosystem services like primary and secondary production. We're losing fish and shellfish habitats and the water purification, which is really a big deal for the oceans and for our for those ecosystems, because of filter feeding organisms like oysters has also slowed down, so that there's not as much water purification happening, which is causing an increase in nutrient and sediment pollution as well as eutrophication. So there's all these ecosystem services that are keeping that equilibrium at bay are going out of whack because of the removal of the top predators and of the fish.